In late summer 1943, the central sector of the Eastern Front was entering a new phase. The German attempt to regain the initiative at Kursk had failed, and Army Group Center now held a deep salient around Smolensk and Roslavl that projected toward Moscow, but was increasingly exposed on its flanks. To the south, Soviet offensives toward the Dnieper were beginning. To the north, the Kalinin and Western fronts were preparing a renewed push through the forests and rivers of the upper Dnieper basin. The September-October advance along the Roslavl Novozybkov axis would be fought within this broader Smolensk operation, yet later be overshadowed by better-known names such as Kursk and a year later Operation Bagration. For Berlin, the Smolensk region remained a key to defensive strategy. Since 1941, the Smolensk land bridge had been the traditional Western approach to Moscow. Holding Smolensk, Roslavl, and the line running toward Bryansk and Novozybkov allowed Army Group Center to shield Belarus, protect east-west rail links, and cover the junctions with Army Groups North and South. In mid-1943, about 850,000 German troops, supported by roughly 8,800 guns, 500 tanks and assault guns, and 700 aircraft, were deployed in the wider Smolensk-Bryansk sector under Army Group Center's command. For Moscow, the priorities were different but equally clear. After Stalingrad and Kursk, Soviet leadership aimed to recover occupied territory and prevent the Wehrmacht from stabilizing a continuous defensive line. Clearing Smolensk Oblast and pushing toward the upper Dnieper and the approaches to Belarus would remove the lingering threat to Moscow, support the Battle of the Dnieper in Ukraine, and create a springboard for deeper operations into Belorussia in 1944. Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky later described the Smolensk axis, together with the Donbass and left bank Ukraine offensives, as parts of a single strategic concept linking the 1943 campaign to subsequent operations. The Red Army committed significant resources to the Central Front to implement this concept. By August 1943, the Western Front under General Vasily Sokolovsky and the Kalinin Front under General Andrei Yeremenko controlled a combined force of about 1,250,000 personnel, more than 20,000 guns and mortars, around 1,430 tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 1,100 aircraft in the Smolensk operation. Their armies included elite formations such as the 10th Guards Army and 39th Army, as well as mechanized and tank corps intended to exploit breakthroughs toward Roslavl, Smolensk, and further southwest toward the Bryansk and Novozybkov areas. Opposite them, the Wehrmacht had used the long pause in 1942 to 1943 to build a dense defensive system. In front of Smolensk and Roslavl, the German 3rd Panzer, 4th and 9th Armies occupied multiple trench lines reinforced with anti-tank ditches, minefields, concrete firing points, and fortified localities. 2nd and 3rd defensive zones were sited 10 kilometers or more behind the front, while additional lines followed major water obstacles such as the Desna and the Dnieper. Urban centers including Yelnya, Spaz-Demensk, and Roslavl were turned into strong points integrated with road and rail nodes. German planners expected further Soviet attacks in this sector and regarded it as too important to abandon voluntarily. The terrain itself shaped the coming operation. Smolensk Oblast and the neighboring Bryansk region formed a slightly hilly plain cut by ravines with extensive forests, marshes, and undergrowth. Numerous rivers, among them the Dnieper, Desna, and Sozh, flowed generally southward, with higher and steeper western banks usually held by German forces. Poorly developed road networks and frequent rainfall turned unpaved routes into mud, complicating Soviet logistics and mechanized movement. At the same time, the Smolensk and Roslavl rail junctions gave Army Group Center relatively efficient lateral communications, enabling rapid transfer of reserves within the salient and toward threatened sectors such as Novozybkov. The occupation environment added another layer of complexity. Smolensk had been under German control since 1941, and by 1943, the region's industry and agriculture were heavily damaged. Soviet post-war assessments estimated that in Smolensk, Oblast, roughly 80% of urban housing and about half of rural living space had been destroyed, along with many factories. Local populations experienced a combination of forced labor, requisitions, and security operations. Some inhabitants cooperated with the occupation administration, while others supported or joined partisan detachments. For German field commanders, constant partisan attacks, intensified during the large-scale rail war and concert sabotage campaigns against rail lines, complicated supply and troop movements just as the Red Army prepared its autumn offensive. Both sides tried to assess what would come next. At Soviet headquarters, staff officers studied the failures and partial successes of earlier attempts to crack the Smolensk defences in August and early September 1943, noting the strength of German positions and the difficulties of coordinating infantry, armour, and artillery in wooded terrain. Reports from the front described divisions reduced to 60% of their authorised strength after weeks of fighting, yet still scheduled for renewed assaults. German intelligence, for its part, monitored Soviet build-ups and tried to determine whether the main threat lay in the central sector or further south along the Dnieper. The result was a tense equilibrium. Both camps expected further large-scale engagements, but neither anticipated that the September push toward Roslavl, Smolensk, and the Novozybkov direction would later be seen as one of the steps that prepared the ground for the decisive blows of 1944. In early September 1943, the pause imposed at the end of the second stage of the Smolensk operation ended. Staffs on both sides used the interval from 7 to about 13 September to regroup. Soviet armies rotated depleted rifle divisions out of the foremost positions, brought fresh formations forward, and concentrated artillery and engineer assets opposite selected sectors. German forces thinned quiet sectors to reinforce threatened areas near Yartsevo, Smolensk, and Roslavl, while higher command debated whether to hold the salient or conduct a stepwise withdrawal to shorter lines farther west. In this environment, the Soviet High Command issued new directives that effectively defined the opening phase of what later analysis would identify as the Roslavl Novozybkov axis of the campaign. The Western Front was ordered to complete the encirclement and capture of Smolensk and Roslavl, then develop the offensive toward Orsha and the upper Dnieper crossings. The Kalinin Front's task was to support this thrust from the north, pressing toward Dukovshchina and Demidov, disrupting German lateral movements and preventing organised withdrawal. On the southern flank of the sector, plans already anticipated the need to push beyond Roslavl toward the Bryansk-Novozybkov line, though this would unfold later. Command structures on both sides were clearly defined by this point. On the Soviet side, front headquarters coordinated multiple combined arms armies, each built around several rifle corps, with attached tank and self-propelled artillery regiments. Air support was assigned to dedicated air armies that planned concentrated sorties during the initial breakthrough days. On the German side, Army Group Center directed 3 field armies in the sector, each controlling corps with 2 to 4 divisions, supported by corps-level artillery and small armoured reserves. Tactical air units were redistributed constantly, reinforcing whichever part of the front appeared most threatened. The new Soviet offensive phase opened in mid-September, with synchronized artillery preparations along a wide arc east and northeast of Smolensk. Barrages were planned to cut wire, neutralize strongpoints, and interdict known artillery positions rather than simply saturate the entire front. Infantry assault battalions moved first, probing for weak points, followed by rifle regiments in depth. In several sectors, the initial advance on the first day reached between 3 and 8 kilometers, enough to compromise the first German defensive belt, but not yet to force a general retreat. One of the key areas in this opening phase lay north of Smolensk. where Soviet units advanced toward Dukovshchina and Demidov. Here, forest edges and small river lines gave German battalions cover and fields of fire, and counterattacks were launched almost immediately using assault guns and local reserves. Soviet reports from the period describe repeated efforts to widen narrow penetrations to a frontage sufficient for the later commitment of mechanized units. For German commanders, the priority was to seal these penetrations before they could be exploited, even at the cost of drawing forces away from other, still quiet sectors. On the approaches east of Smolensk and Roslavl, rifle divisions moved through areas previously fought over in August. Many positions had changed hands multiple times. Trenches and shell craters already marked the landscape. This affected both sides. Soviet units could use some captured German works as start lines. German defenders often fell back to previously prepared secondary positions. For civilians in these zones, the renewed offensive meant another round of shelling, forced evacuations, and rapid changes of authority as local administrations followed the moving front. South of Smolensk, where the road and rail lines converging on Roslavl formed a key objective, the opening moves focused on creating bridgeheads over the Desna and its tributaries. Engineer units laid pontoon crossings under fire, while assault detachments worked to clear the western banks. The goal was not only to push the front line westward, but also to secure crossings robust enough to support heavy artillery, and later, tank formations that could drive toward Roslavl and beyond. German frontline reports from this period reflect a growing concern about the sustainability of their positions. Divisions in the Smolensk-Roslavl area often held extended frontages with reduced battalion strengths after months of combat. As Soviet forces renewed their attacks, German staff officers noted difficulties in maintaining continuous lines, especially where river crossings and road junctions became focal points of Soviet pressure. Short, sharp counterattacks were still possible, but the capacity to mount larger operational-level ripostes was limited. For Soviet soldiers, the opening phase combined signs of progress with high local losses. Units that had advanced only a few kilometers in August now recorded deeper daily gains. Yet attacks on fortified villages and wooded ridges still required repeated assaults. Company and battalion reports describe close coordination with artillery observers and sappers, but also emphasize fatigue and reduced strengths in frontline companies after successive days of attacking. By the end of this opening phase, the outline of the coming breakthrough was visible. Soviet forces had widened several penetrations, reached the outskirts of key communication hubs like Yartsevo, and secured initial bridgeheads over important rivers. German units were still holding the main urban centers, including Smolensk and Roslavl, but their defensive network was beginning to fray. The stage was set for the next escalation, in which the fighting would concentrate around the largest strongpoints and decide whether the front line would stabilize once more or be driven back toward the Dnieper and the Bryansk-Novozybkov region. In the directives that framed the September-October phase, the Soviet High Command linked local tasks around Smolensk and Roslavl to broader 1943-44 objectives. Strategically, Moscow sought to eliminate the long-standing threat from the Smolensk salient, reach the upper Dnieper and Desna, and create conditions for later advances into Belorussia. Operational orders to the Western Front emphasized three successive goals: encircle and capture Smolensk, seize Roslavl and its road rail network, and push the front line toward the Orsha and Bryansk axes, opening approaches that would later be used in the 1944 campaign. For the Western Front, this meant assigning clear roles to individual armies. Formations north of Smolensk were to fix and erode the German defences, while those east and southeast of the city aimed at decisive penetrations. Army and front planners allocated artillery densities in critical sectors that often exceeded 100 guns and mortars per kilometre, with additional heavy pieces reserved for counter-battery missions. tank, and self-propelled gun regiments were grouped in echelons behind the breakthrough sectors, intended to exploit any collapse and move quickly toward Roslavl and key river crossings. The Kalinin Front's planning had complementary goals. Its armies were instructed to maintain constant pressure north of Smolensk, preventing German withdrawals along the Demidov-Dukovshchina line and threatening the rear of German units defending the city and the Roslavl approaches. This would compel Army Group Center to hold forward positions longer than might otherwise have been the case, increasing the risk of local encirclements and reducing the reserves available to counterattacks toward Roslavl and later the Bryansk-Novozybkov direction. Logistics played a central role in Soviet preparations. Staff officers calculated daily ammunition expenditure for each phase of the offensive, building stocks of artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and engineer stores in forward depots along railheads east of Smolensk. Supply plans had to account for damaged rail lines, partisan activity, and the limited capacity of dirt roads that became difficult in wet weather. Fuel for tank and mechanized units was stockpiled as close as possible to intended breakthrough sectors. But planners recognized that sustaining mobile operations beyond the Dnieper and Desna rivers would remain challenging. On the German side, strategic goals were shaped by a mixture of doctrine and constraint. Army Group Center was directed to hold the Smolensk-Roslavl line as long as feasible in order to protect the land bridge to Moscow, shield the rear of Army Group North, and cover the northern flank of the formations retreating in Ukraine. High Command instructions stressed the importance of maintaining a continuous front and using prepared defensive belts to inflict heavy casualties on Soviet attacks, trading space only when necessary to avoid encirclement. German operational planning for this sector relied on a layered defense. Divisions deployed forward battalions in outpost lines, with main forces in 1st and 2nd defensive positions anchored on villages, woods, and river lines. Corps reserves, including assault gun units and the remaining tanks, were intended for counterattacks against Soviet penetrations rather than for large-scale offensive operations. Engineers continued to expand field fortifications, laying new minefields and reinforcing bunkers around Smolensk, Roslavl, and road junctions leading toward Bryansk and Novozybkov. Supply considerations for Army Group Center were more constrained than earlier in the war. Rail traffic from Germany had to serve multiple fronts, and the loss of territory elsewhere reduced access to fuel and replacements. Ammunition stocks for artillery and anti-tank units were carefully rationed, with priority given to sectors judged most threatened. Despite these limitations, German planners still counted on prepared positions, interior lines of communication, and shorter supply routes within the salient to compensate partly for numerical inferiority. Intelligence assessments influenced planning on both sides. Soviet reconnaissance, including aerial photography, prisoner interrogations, and partisan reports, identified new German fieldworks and the approximate grouping of enemy reserves. These reports stressed the continued strength of the German defensive system, but also noted signs of strain, reduced battalion strengths, frequent redeployment of mobile units, and the destruction of bridges and infrastructure further in the rear, suggesting preparation for eventual withdrawal. German intelligence observed Soviet troop movements and artillery concentrations, but often faced difficulty in distinguishing preparations for local attacks from those for broader operations stretching toward the Dnieper. Propaganda and public communication framed these plans differently for military and civilian audiences. Soviet broadcasts presented the coming offensive as part of a continuous effort to liberate occupied territory, restore the Smolensk region, and push the invaders away from Moscow and the Dnieper basin. German internal briefings emphasized the defensive battle as a necessary shield for the Reich and its allies, portraying the retention of key fortress cities as proof that the front could still be stabilized. In both cases, the strategic planning around Roslavl and Novozybkov was integrated into much larger narratives about the future course of the war. Taken together, these goals and preparations shaped the character of the campaign. the Red Army aimed at a series of connected offensives that would not stop at the recapture of individual cities, but continue toward the Upper Dnieper and the Bryansk-Novozybkov region. Army Group Center sought to use fortifications and local counterattacks to delay that outcome, preserving combat power and time. The clash between these two sets of plans would determine whether the Smolensk salient remained a barrier in front of central Russia or became the starting line for deeper operations into Belorussia in the following year. Before dawn, artillery fire announced the transition from planning to open confrontation. On sectors designated for the main blow, Soviet guns and mortars fired pre-calculated concentrations against German first-line positions, command posts, and suspected artillery batteries. Forward observers corrected fire by telephone and radio as illumination rounds exposed trench patterns and strongpoints. When the barrage shifted deeper, assault companies moved from jumping off trenches toward the first German positions, often advancing through ground that had already been fought over earlier in the summer. North of Smolensk, units of the Kalinin Front tested German defences near Dukovshchina and Demidov. Here, the first engagements unfolded in narrow forest clearings and along small rivers whose banks had been fortified with dugouts and machine gun nests. Soviet rifle battalions, typically reduced to 300 to 400 men after earlier fighting, attacked in waves behind smoke screens. German infantry companies, also below full strength, used pre-sighted fields of fire to break up the initial assaults, then launched platoon-sized counterattacks supported by assault guns and mortars. The result was a series of short, intense clashes that yielded limited territorial gains, but revealed weak points in the German line. On the eastern approaches to Smolensk, the Western Front committed several rifle corps to a concentrated push toward Yartsevo and the city's outer defensive ring. First engagements centered on fortified villages controlling road crossings, where German units had converted stone buildings into firing points and surrounded them with trenches and wire. Soviet assault groups equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges worked methodically through these positions, building by building. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters, yet each captured locality loosened the cohesion of the German forward belt and opened gaps between neighboring divisions. Further south, along the Desna and its tributaries, early clashes revolved around securing bridgeheads. Soviet engineer battalions attempted to launch assault boats and assemble light pontoon bridges under fire, while infantry covered the crossing sites with machine guns and mortars. German defenders had prepared strongpoints on higher western banks and directed artillery against the river margins, aiming to prevent any sustained lodgment. In several places, initial crossings were forced but then lost when counterattacks reached the waterline, forcing Soviet units to rebuild their positions in subsequent attempts. Civilian experience during these first engagements varied by locality. In villages near the front, inhabitants were often ordered to shelter in cellars or evacuated by German authorities as the fighting approached. Some communities saw rapid changes in control, with Soviet troops entering briefly, only to withdraw after local counterattacks, leaving residents exposed to renewed shelling and shifting regulations. Elsewhere, where German positions were still firmly held, occupation routines continued, even as distant artillery and the movement of supply columns indicated that a larger battle was unfolding. Morale patterns on both sides reflected this mixed picture. Soviet soldiers observed that the front was moving, even if slowly, and unit reports noted a sense of purpose linked to the prospect of liberating long-occupied towns. At the same time, repeated assaults against entrenched positions produced company-level casualty lists that underscored the cost of each kilometre. German units recorded fatigue and concern about thinning ranks, yet diaries and reports also mention confidence in the defensive system and in the ability of fieldworks and minefields to offset numerical inferiority. Unexpected local outcomes appeared early. In some sectors, German commanders chose to pull back from forward outposts before being fully pressed, trading small strips of ground for the chance to occupy second-line positions in better order. This occasionally left Soviet assault waves advancing into empty trenches, gaining ground but losing the opportunity to inflict heavier losses on withdrawing defenders. Conversely, in other areas, determined local stands held up Soviet advances far longer than anticipated, disrupting timetables for committing tank units and forcing artillery to repeat preparatory fires against surviving strongpoints. By the end of the first days of heavy fighting, the map had changed, but not yet decisively. Soviet armies had captured a number of villages and minor road junctions, broadened several bridgeheads, and approached the outer defences of Smolensk and Roslavl. German formations retained the main urban centres and most river lines, but their front was no longer a continuous, intact barrier. The early engagements demonstrated both the potential and the limits of offensive action against a prepared defensive system, setting the conditions for a further escalation in which larger formations and deeper objectives would come into play. As September progressed, the fighting intensified and spread along the entire arc from north of Smolensk to the approaches of Roslavl. Initial penetrations, once narrow, were widened by successive attacks, and both sides began to commit additional formations. For the Western Front, this meant bringing more rifle corps into already active sectors, feeding fresh regiments into gaps opened by the first waves. For the Kalinin Front, it involved strengthening pressure on Demidov and Dukovshchina to prevent any orderly German regrouping. The result was a continuous line of engagements in which local actions were increasingly tied to operational decisions at front and army level. Within individual armies, the escalation was visible in the growing scale of artillery and air support. Where earlier attacks had used divisional artillery as the main fire support, later phases saw entire artillery divisions deployed to create concentrated fire on key strongpoints and river crossings. Air armies intensified sorties against rail stations, bridges, and known German assembly areas in the Roslavl and Smolensk hinterland, aiming to disrupt the movement of reserves and supplies. German air units responded with fighter patrols and fighter-bomber attacks on Soviet bridgeheads and marching columns, leading to a denser pattern of air combat over the front. For German commanders, the growing pressure produced a series of local crises. Divisions that had held their foremost positions in early September now reported battalions reduced to 200 to 250 men, with companies often below half strength. Requests for reinforcement or relief were only partially met, as Army Group Centre had limited reserves and competing demands from other sectors. To stabilise the front, Corps Headquarters ordered short withdrawals from exposed salients, combined with counterattacks aimed at cutting off Soviet spearheads that had crossed rivers or pushed into the gaps between stronger strongpoints. Terrain and weather compounded these difficulties. As autumn advanced, rainfall increased, turning fields and forest tracks into mud. Soviet supply units found it harder to bring ammunition and fuel forward. Trucks bogged down, and horse-drawn columns had to be used more extensively. German formations faced similar problems in moving artillery to new positions or in concentrating forces for counterattacks. In low-lying areas along the Desna and its tributaries, rivers overflowed their banks, expanding marshy zones and limiting the manoeuvrability of armoured and motorised units on both sides. Casualty figures mounted steadily. By the second half of September, the combined losses of the Western and Kalinin fronts in the Smolensk sector since late August were estimated at several 100,000 personnel, including killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties in the same period were smaller in absolute terms, but represented a higher proportion of the available infantry strength in Army Group Centre. Rifle divisions that had begun the operation with nominal strengths of 8,000 to 9,000 men sometimes counted 4,000 to 5,000 effectives. German infantry divisions often reported comparable reductions, with frontline battalions shrinking while rear area and support elements remained relatively intact. These attrition patterns forced adjustments in tactics. Soviet armies increasingly relied on concentrated attacks by smaller numbers of well-supported units, rather than broad simultaneous assaults along extended fronts. Selected divisions received priority in artillery and engineer support for renewed efforts against specific strongpoints, while neighboring sectors conducted holding actions. German commanders, facing reduced infantry numbers, reorganized companies into ad hoc battle groups and focused their remaining armored vehicles on rapid reaction roles, counterattacking wherever Soviet breakthroughs seemed most dangerous. Political and command pressures added another dimension to the crisis. Soviet front commanders reported daily to the Stavka on progress towards Smolensk and Roslavl, balancing the need to maintain momentum with concerns about the condition of their units. Orders from higher headquarters emphasized the strategic importance of the sector and the necessity of sustaining offensive pressure despite losses. Within Army Group Center, senior officers debated the risks of holding forward positions too long. While some advocated earlier withdrawal to pre-prepared lines closer to the Dnieper and Bryansk, decisions from higher command stressed the political and symbolic importance of retaining cities like Smolensk as long as possible. Civilian populations were drawn more deeply into the unfolding events. In German-controlled areas, evacuations of administrative personnel, archives, and industrial equipment from Smolensk and Roslavl intensified as Soviet artillery range grew. Forced laborers and prisoners were transferred westward, often on foot or in overcrowded trains. In territories already retaken by the Red Army, local authorities and military administrations began preliminary efforts to restore basic services and register inhabitants, even while the front remained close and artillery fire was still audible. The psychological toll reflected the escalation. Frontline soldiers on both sides experienced prolonged exposure to artillery bombardment, close-quarters assaults, and rapidly changing orders as positions were taken, lost, and retaken. Letters and reports from the period describe a sense of constant motion without clear endpoints. German troops noted successive withdrawals from previously familiar positions, while Soviet units recorded the repeated requirement to reorganize depleted companies before returning to the attack. By the third week of September, the cumulative effect of these developments had created a situation in which localized setbacks could quickly become operational crises. Soviet successes in widening bridgeheads and approaching key junctions threatened to unhinge entire sections of the German line. German counterattacks still had the potential to blunt individual advances, but their ability to restore the overall defensive configuration was diminishing. The campaign was approaching a phase in which decisions about holding or abandoning major centers, such as Smolensk and Roslavl, could no longer be postponed without risking larger encirclements. The peak of the campaign came in the days leading up to the 25th of September, when the pressure on Smolensk and Roslavl reached its highest intensity. By this point, Soviet forces had created several deep salients in the German line. Army and front commands decided to convert these into full breakthroughs by concentrating their remaining reserves. Rifle divisions that had been resting for only a few days were moved forward again. Tank brigades were brought up along the few usable roads, and artillery units were shifted to support the main axes of advance, even at the cost of leaving secondary sectors with only minimal fire support. Around Smolensk, the Western Front focused on encircling rather than storming the city in a single frontal assault. Units advancing from the northeast and southeast aimed to cut the key rail and road lines leading west and southwest, gradually tightening a ring around the urban area. On the northern side, Soviet formations pressed toward Dukhovshchina and further west, threatening to outflank German positions still clinging to the outer defensive lines of Smolensk. On the southern side, armies moving from the Desna bridgeheads advanced in the direction of Pochinok, seeking to meet counterparts coming from the east and close remaining escape corridors. German High Command responded by issuing successive orders to hold critical nodes as long as possible while preparing for a phased withdrawal. In Smolensk itself, garrison and field units combined to establish strongpoints in industrial zones, railway yards, and masonry buildings. Streets were blocked with rubble and anti-tank obstacles, and artillery pieces were positioned for direct fire down long avenues. However, as Soviet units reached the main supply routes west of the city and subjected them to artillery and air attack, the risk of encirclement increased. Staff calculations showed that if the front did not move, several divisions could lose their lines of retreat. Around Roslavl, the fighting reached comparable intensity. The city's position at the intersection of roads and railways linking Smolensk, Bryansk, and the Dnieper crossings made it a priority for both sides. Soviet armies moving from the east and northeast sought to cut the approaches and force German units to abandon the city under pressure rather than withdraw in good order. German defenders, supported by assault guns and the remaining tanks, contested each village on the approaches and attempted local counterattacks to keep at least one route open toward the southwest. Inside the urban areas, conditions for soldiers and civilians deteriorated. In Smolensk, remaining inhabitants sheltered in basements as artillery duels intensified. German authorities organized evacuations for administrative personnel and some civilians, but transport capacity was limited. As front lines approached, both sides used heavy weapons within or near residential districts, leading to further destruction of housing and infrastructure already damaged in earlier phases of the war. Similar patterns occurred in Roslavl, where depots, workshops, and rail installations became targets for both artillery and air attacks. Losses during this high-intensity period were significant. Individual Soviet rifle divisions sometimes reported daily casualties in the hundreds as they attacked fortified quarters and river crossings. German units recorded comparable proportional losses while conducting rearguard actions and counterattacks. Medical services on both sides struggled to cope. Field hospitals filled quickly, and evacuation routes were overburdened by the combination of wounded, retreating units and displaced civilians. Command decisions at this stage balanced military necessity against the risk of encirclement. On the Soviet side, front commanders argued for maintaining continuous pressure to prevent the enemy from stabilizing new lines closer to the Dnieper. Orders emphasized the need to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery closely, especially in urban fighting, to reduce unnecessary losses while still meeting deadlines for the capture of key objectives. On the German side, decisions to withdraw from Smolensk and Roslavl were delayed to gain time, but eventually became unavoidable once Soviet forces cut or threatened the last reliable exit routes. By 25th September, the combined effect of sustained attacks, artillery bombardment, and pressure along the flanks forced a major shift. Soviet troops entered Smolensk from several directions, encountering scattered resistance from rearguards and isolated strongpoints, but no longer facing a coherent city-wide defense. On the same date, units advancing from the east and northeast reached Roslavl and took control of its main facilities as German combat units pulled back toward new positions further west and southwest. The fall of these cities marked the culmination of the campaign's most intense phase, with the front line now clearly shifting toward the upper Dnieper basin and the Bryansk-Novozybkov region. With Smolensk and Roslavl changing hands, both sides adjusted their methods to the new configuration of the front. For Soviet commanders, success did not end with entering the cities. They now had to prevent German units from forming a stable defense farther west. Orders emphasized rapid reorganization of assault formations into pursuit groups, combining selected rifle regiments, tank brigades, and mobile artillery to keep contact with retreating forces. Divisions that had just fought through urban districts were instructed to leave skeleton garrisons behind and move on, while second echelon units and local commandant services took over security and administration in the liberated areas. Adaptation was also visible at lower levels. Rifle regiments revised their assault tactics in light of recent fighting, placing greater emphasis on reconnaissance groups and small assault detachments rather than massed frontal waves. Engineer units refined procedures for clearing minefields and establishing crossings over damaged bridges, using captured German materials wherever possible. Artillery staffs adjusted their fire plans to account for more fluid conditions, shifting from long preparatory barrages to shorter, more flexible concentrations designed to support mobile operations and counter developing threats. German forces withdrawing toward new lines along the upper Dnieper and in the Bryansk-Novozybkov direction relied on improvised resistance to slow the Soviet advance. Rearguard detachments, often built from depleted infantry companies and elements of engineer or signals units, received instructions to hold key road junctions or river crossings for specified periods before disengaging. Field commanders organized Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups, combining infantry, assault guns, and anti-tank guns to conduct short counterattacks, regain lost localities, or delay Soviet pursuit, long enough for main bodies to reach new positions. These delaying actions were accompanied by systematic destruction of infrastructure. German engineers damaged or removed rails and sleepers, demolished bridges, and disabled industrial facilities that could be used to support Soviet logistics. In some towns west of Smolensk and Roslavl, depots and warehouses were burned as units passed through, reducing the supplies that could fall into Soviet hands. This scorched earth policy aimed to complicate the Red Army's ability to convert territorial gains into a firm operational base for further offensives. Local resistance movements, particularly partisan detachments operating in the forests of Smolensk and the neighboring regions, adapted their activities to the new situation. During the earlier phases of the campaign, many partisan operations had focused on disrupting German rail transport and communications behind the front. As the line moved west, these groups shifted to guiding advancing Soviet units through forest tracks, providing information on German rearguard positions and helping secure newly liberated settlements. In some cases, partisan detachments cooperated directly with regular troops in seizing bridges and crossings before withdrawing German units could destroy them. Resource management became a central concern for both sides. Soviet quartermasters had to integrate captured supplies into their own system, distinguishing usable stocks of ammunition, fuel, and food from those sabotaged or rendered unsafe. Repair units moved quickly into Smolensk and Roslavl to assess the condition of rail yards and workshops, determining how soon trains could again operate through these junctions. On the German side, the priority was to salvage as much equipment as possible during the retreat, evacuating artillery, vehicles, and specialist personnel while leaving behind only what could not be moved in time. Psychological adaptation followed the physical changes at the front. For Soviet soldiers and officers, the liberation of long-occupied regional centers confirmed that persistent offensive operations could yield strategic results, but it also raised awareness of the costs already paid. Reports from political departments noted increased confidence, yet also recorded concerns about unit exhaustion and the need for rest and replacements. German troops, facing successive withdrawals, adjusted from a posture of holding long-prepared positions to one of successive defensive lines, with a greater emphasis on flexibility and survival than on maintaining specific localities. Civilians, too, modified their behavior in response to the shifting lines. In areas now under Soviet control, local administrators and specialists began rebuilding basic services, often with minimal resources, reopening schools in undamaged buildings, re-establishing food distribution, and repairing wells and electrical infrastructure. In zones still under German authority west of the former front, inhabitants confronted new restrictions and additional requisitions as retreating units sought food, transport animals, and lodging. Some communities prepared for the possibility of imminent fighting by digging shelters or planning evacuation routes, drawing on experiences from earlier phases of the war. Innovation extended to the use of terrain. Soviet forces studied the pattern of ridges, river loops, and forests west of Smolensk to identify favorable positions for artillery and air observation, and to choose routes that minimized exposure to German fire. German staffs, in turn, selected new defensive lines that exploited natural obstacles, planning to integrate them with remaining fortifications along the upper Dnieper and in front of Bryansk. Both sides thus used the brief interval after the capture of Smolensk and Roslavl to recalibrate their methods, preparing either to push the front deeper into the Bryansk Novozybkov region or to form a new barrier where further resistance could be organized. The turning point of the Roslavl Novozybkov offensive unfolded quietly in the days after 25th September. With Smolensk and Roslavl no longer in German hands, the central question shifted from whether these cities could be held to where the next stable defensive line might be formed. Army Group Center ordered a controlled withdrawal toward positions anchored on the upper Dnieper, the Soch, and the Desna, aiming to avoid encirclement while preserving as many units as possible. This decision effectively conceded the loss of the long-held Smolensk salient and acknowledged that further defense would have to be conducted deeper in Belarusian territory. For the Soviet command, the same days marked the transition from breakthrough to pursuit. Western and Kalinin fronts received instructions to exploit success, but also to avoid overextending beyond their supply capabilities. Rifle armies were directed to press west and southwest along the axes leading toward Orsha, Gomel, and Bryansk, while mechanized and tank formations sought to cut key withdrawal routes. At the same time, staffs reviewed ammunition and fuel stocks, aware that crossing successive rivers and advancing into areas with damaged infrastructure would slow the pace of operations. On the ground, the turning point took the form of continuous movement rather than a single dramatic battle. German rearguards fought delaying actions at successive river lines and road junctions, then pulled back before they could be enveloped. Soviet units reported entering abandoned positions that had been mined or partially destroyed, indicating that the retreat was being carried out according to prearranged plans. Where Soviet spearheads managed to outflank these rearguards, short encirclements occurred, but there was no large-scale pocket comparable to earlier encirclement battles in other sectors. The campaign's momentum shifted in another sense, from efforts to break a dense static defense toward confronting an opponent who chose space over immediate resistance. In late September and early October, Soviet commanders noticed that some of the heaviest fortifications east of the Dnieper were now behind them. Instead, they faced hastily prepared field positions and natural barriers. This change in the character of German resistance underscored that the strategic objective of eliminating the Smolensk bridgehead had been largely achieved, even though fighting continued as the front moved toward the upper Dnieper basin and the Bryansk-Novozybkov area. Civilian experience reflected this moment of transition. In Smolensk and Roslavl, newly established Soviet administrations began cataloguing destruction and organizing initial relief measures, while sporadic artillery fire still passed overhead toward retreating German units. West of the former front, communities witnessed streams of German columns moving through. Infantry, artillery, rear services, and convoys of carts and motor vehicles carrying equipment and evacuees. For many inhabitants, this signaled not only the end of a particular phase of occupation, but also the likelihood that the fighting and its accompanying risks would soon reach their own districts. The psychological balance also shifted. For Soviet personnel, the liberation of regional centers that had been under occupation since 1941 and the visible westward movement of the front line confirmed that sustained offensive operations could break entrenched defenses. Reports from political and staff organs noted an increase in confidence, but also emphasized the strains caused by continuous fighting, depleted units, and the need to rebuild command structures at battalion and regiment level. German reports, in contrast, recorded concern about the implications of abandoning Smolensk and Roslavl, long presented as forward bastions. Officers and soldiers were now instructed to focus on preserving combat power for future battles rather than holding specific cities. At higher headquarters, the turning point was interpreted in operational and strategic terms. Soviet planners saw the new line, now significantly west of its early summer position, as a starting platform for future operations into Belarusia and toward the Baltic Black Sea corridor. The recovery of rail junctions at Smolensk and Roslavl allowed for the gradual restoration of east-west transport, which could later support larger concentrations further forward. German planners, reviewing the retreat, concluded that although major encirclements had been avoided in this sector, the loss of the Smolensk region shortened their operational depth and reduced their ability to maneuver between the central and southern parts of the front. By October 2nd, when the offensive phase in this area formally wound down, the cumulative effect of decisions taken in late September was clear. The front line now ran closer to the upper Dnieper and the approaches to the Bryansk-Novozybkov region. The German attempt to maintain a stable, fortified salient around Smolensk and Roslavl had given way to a more fluid defense further west. For the Red Army, the campaign had reached a point at which immediate gains were consolidated, and attention began to turn to how this new configuration could be used in the next year's operations. By early October, the tempo of combat operations in the Roslavl Novozybkov sector slowed. Orders from Soviet headquarters instructed armies to secure their new positions, restore unit cohesion, and reorganize rear services. Rifle divisions that had advanced farthest were told to dig in along new lines west of Smolensk and Roslavl, prepare defensive positions, and conduct local reconnaissance rather than large-scale attacks. Reserve formations were brought forward to occupy key junctions and river crossings, freeing exhausted units for brief periods of rest and reconstitution. For Army Group Center, the withdrawal from the Smolensk region ended with the establishment of new defensive lines further west and southwest, often anchored on the upper Dnieper, the Soch, and approaches to Bryansk and Gomel. Divisions that had retreated from Smolensk and Roslavl reorganized along these positions, integrating remnants of battle groups and rearguard detachments. Corps and army staffs conducted rapid assessments of combat strengths, redistributing artillery and anti-tank weapons to compensate for heavy infantry losses. The emphasis shifted from holding specific cities to maintaining a continuous front that could resist further Soviet advances. The immediate aftermath in Smolensk and Roslavl was marked by an overlap of military and civilian priorities. Soviet military authorities first secured transport hubs, bridges, and warehouses that had survived demolition or fire to support ongoing logistics. At the same time, local party and administrative structures were reintroduced or rebuilt. Teams of specialists began surveying damage to housing, factories, and public buildings, compiling inventories of what could be repaired and what was beyond use. In many districts, basic services such as water supply and medical care were restored only in rudimentary form, relying on improvised equipment and limited stocks of supplies. Humanitarian questions emerged quickly. The population that had remained under occupation for more than 2 years faced shortages of food, fuel, and clothing. Agricultural production in surrounding rural areas had been disrupted by requisitions, forced labor, and fighting. With the front still relatively close, large-scale relief shipments were limited by rail and road conditions. Local authorities organized rationing systems, reopened bakeries and mills where possible, and mobilized inhabitants for clearing rubble, repairing roads, and rebuilding bridges. Simultaneously, investigations into occupation-era collaboration and crimes began, adding a legal and political dimension to the immediate post-liberation period. For German forces, the withdrawal left behind not only physical destruction, but also a changed operational situation. The loss of Smolensk and Roslavl reduced their ability to shift units between the northern and southern sectors of the Eastern Front. rail routes became longer and more exposed to Soviet air and partisan attacks. Divisions that had retreated often arrived at new positions with fewer infantry than authorized, relying more heavily on remaining artillery, engineers, and support personnel. Planning for the next months focused on stabilizing the shortened front and integrating replacements and reorganized units into a coherent defense. Prisoners of war and displaced persons embodied another aspect of the aftermath. Soviet units collected German and Allied prisoners from overrun positions, abandoned field hospitals, and surrendered rearguards, transferring them to collection points in the rear. At the same time, former forced laborers, prisoners, and evacuees began to move in multiple directions. Some attempted to return to their home villages in newly liberated areas. Others were sent inland for medical treatment or further screening by Soviet security organs. German columns moving west absorbed remaining administrative personnel and civilians from evacuation centers, further complicating the logistics of the retreat. The landscape itself bore the marks of the campaign's conclusion. Roads west of Smolensk and Roslavl were lined with destroyed vehicles, abandoned carts, and damaged artillery pieces left where they had broken down or run out of fuel. Fields and forest edges contained minefields, trenches, and shell craters that would remain hazardous long after the front had moved on. In the urban centres, central districts were often heavily damaged, while some outlying neighbourhoods remained partially intact, creating a patchwork of destruction and surviving structures that influenced how reconstruction efforts would proceed. On the Soviet side, staff analyses of the operation began even before the last reports arrived from the front. Commanders summarized the course of the offensive, identifying factors that had contributed to success and those that had limited the speed or depth of the advance. Particular attention was paid to the challenges of conducting large-scale operations in forested, river-crossed terrain, and to the high personnel and material costs of breaching layered defensive systems. These evaluations would inform planning for subsequent campaigns, including those projected for the following year in Belarus. In the German command structure, after-action reports likewise examined the withdrawal. Discussions emphasized the effectiveness of prepared defenses east of Smolensk, the impact of Soviet artillery and air superiority, and the constraints imposed by limited reserves and supply difficulties. Some officers argued that earlier withdrawals might have preserved more combat power, while others maintained that holding the Smolensk line as long as possible had delayed Soviet advances towards central Belorussia. In both interpretations, the outcome in the Roslavl Novozybkov sector was recognized as a significant adjustment of the central front rather than an isolated local setback. In retrospect, the Roslavl Novozybkov offensive formed one link in a chain of operations that reshaped the central sector of the Eastern Front between summer 1943 and summer 1944. Together with the wider Smolensk operation and the Battle of the Dnieper further south, it removed the long-standing German salient east of the Dnieper and pushed the front into positions from which later offensives into Belorussia could be launched. The liberation of Smolensk and Roslavl on the 25th of September 1943 marked not only the recovery of major regional centres, but also the loss for Army Group Centre of junctions that had supported its operations since 1941. Strategically, the new line established after early October provided the Red Army with a deeper forward base. Rail links running through the reconstructed Smolensk and Roslavl junctions gradually restored capacity to bring formations, ammunition, and fuel into the central front. From this platform, Soviet planners prepared the winter and spring campaigns of 1943 to 44, including operations toward Orsha, Vitebsk, and Gomel, which in turn set the stage for the summer 1944 offensive known as Operation Bagration. The experience of breaching layered defenses in the forests and river valleys west of Moscow contributed directly to the methods later used against German positions in Belarusia. For the Wehrmacht, the outcome had lasting consequences. The loss of the Smolensk region shortened the distance between the Soviet front and the borders of East Prussia and the central Polish and Belarusian territories. It reduced the operational depth available to Army Group Center and limited its options for lateral movement and counter-concentration. Subsequent German defensive plans in the central sector had to be built on fewer prepared positions and with diminished resources, a situation that became evident when the front was broken again in 1944. Casualty figures underline the character of the campaign as a prolonged attritional struggle. Estimates vary, but Soviet forces in the Smolensk-Roslavl sector between late August and early October 1943 are generally assessed as having lost several 100,000 personnel in total, including killed, wounded, and missing. German losses were lower in absolute numbers, yet represented a significant portion of the infantry strength of Army Group Center, which could not be fully replaced. These figures illustrate that the territorial shift westward came at a high cost to both sides, and that the relative advantage gained by the Red Army was measured more in strategic position than in preserved manpower. Economically and socially, the liberation of Smolensk Oblast and adjacent districts began a long process of reconstruction. The destruction recorded in post-war surveys, large proportions of urban housing, industrial plants, transport infrastructure, and public buildings, meant that recovery would extend far beyond the end of hostilities. Nevertheless, the return of central administration and the re-establishment of transport lines allowed agricultural and industrial activity to resume in stages, contributing to the restoration of the Soviet rear area and supporting continued military operations. In terms of memory, the Roslavl Novozybkov offensive occupies an intermediate place. In local and regional histories of Smolensk and the neighboring territories, the September 1943 liberation dates are prominent, commemorated with monuments, plaques, and anniversary ceremonies. Veteran accounts and archival documents provide detailed narratives of individual units and localities. At the broader international level, however, the operation is often overshadowed by more widely known engagements, such as Kursk, the Battle of the Dnieper, and Operation Bagration. As a result, the events of September-October 1943 tend to appear as part of a larger Smolensk framework, rather than as a distinct campaign. Historiographical debates focus less on the question of whether the operation was important, and more on how its significance should be weighed within the sequence of 1943-44 offensives. Some studies emphasize its role in drawing German reserves away from other sectors, and in testing methods for future deep operations. Others underline the limitations revealed by the relatively slow pace of advance and high losses, arguing that these factors influenced later decisions to concentrate even greater material resources before launching Bagration. Across these interpretations, the offensive is recognized as a necessary, if costly, step in dismantling the German position in central Russia. From a broader perspective, the Roslavl Novozybkov campaign illustrates how medium-scale operations, conducted over weeks in difficult terrain and without a single decisive encirclement, could nonetheless have major cumulative effects. It shows how local advances, the capture of regional centers, and the steady erosion of defensive networks combine to alter the strategic map. While often less visible than more dramatic battles, these operations created the conditions under which later breakthroughs became possible, linking the liberation of the Smolensk region in 1943 to the larger shifts of 1944 and the eventual collapse of the German Eastern Front.